Well, happy Earth Day, everybody, and welcome to City Lights. And to those of you online as well, hello. Thanks for joining us. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. Always an honor and a privilege to be able to do so. So, this is part 2 of our Earth Day celebration here at City Lights. We try to do something each year if we can. So every year, April 22nd marks Earth Day. This began with a senator from Wisconsin back in 1970 who was really concerned about the deterioration of the environment and then announced the idea of having a teach-in cross-country. Well, this kind of blew up and then became kind of international. And now you've got events happening all over the world on this day. And also, it led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which of course is being dismantled at this very moment. But also the passage of a lot of other first and kind of one-of-a-kind laws. So it makes a lot of sense that we have Malcolm Harris here with us tonight. That's your applause cue, yes. Celebrating a book which is, very, very pertinent to the day. It's called What's Left? 3 Paths Through the Planetary Crisis. It's published by Little and Brown and Company. It's a guide for collective political action against climate apocalypse. It really cuts through a lot of the hype and gets very real about what remaining options we may have. So Malcolm Harris, as many of you know, is the author of the national bestseller Palo Alto. He is also finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, also the author of several other books, Shit is Fucked Up, also Bullshit, History Since the End of History. Please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Malcolm Harris.
Thank you all so much. And thanks so much for City Lights for hosting me. This is a real thrill for me personally. I used to take the train up from the peninsula when I was a high schooler, not even to buy the books, just to be around all the books and the books that get chosen to be in City Lights. And so the idea that not only are some of my books here, but that I get to come here and talk to all of you and try and sell you on it is a real personal thrill. So thank you for joining me in that. I'm going to talk for probably about half an hour, maybe less if I can manage it, about why I decided to write this book, sort of the premise, the framework for it, and then we'll have plenty of time for whatever questions you may have. One question I get asked a lot by a bunch of interviewers is why write a climate book, which is also something my agent asked me. Because climate books actually don't seem to sell that well, even though it is the most pertinent fact in the world right now, period, that we are destroying the habitability of our own climate. And for me, it was about approaching this question in a different way than I had seen it approached before. And that went back to an experience I had in 2019 when I was doing some consulting for the Shell Oil Company. I really was doing some consulting for the Shell Oil Company. And it's because my first book is called Kids These Days, The Making of Millennials. And I didn't know when I wrote it that all generational writing, period, is just like advertising objects for corporate consulting services. So you write a book about a generation, and then all these companies pay you to tell them how to sell to those generations, or how the demographics of those generations are going to affect their business practices. And I had no idea this was the case when I wrote this book. But one of the first calls I got from a corporation after I published it was from Shell, the Shell Oil Company, which is one of the largest oil companies in the world, privately held oil companies in the world. And they're also one of the leaders in corporate planning. They've had a corporate planning scenario, what they call the scenarios team, for decades. It goes back to the 70s and sort of hippie ideas about thinking deep into the future. And Shell has tried to run its business partly by thinking deeply into the future about how things were going to change. And so they run these scenarios planning exercises where they get Shell executives, select Shell employees, and then some outside consulting people together in a conference room for a weekend. You go out to nice dinners and you chat about what's going to happen, and you do some sort of formal exercises and whatever. And so they reached out to me and said, we want you to come and talk with us about the millennial generation. And they were interested in the politics of the millennial generation, even the left-wing politics of the millennial generation, because their thinking was that millennials were going to get a hold of investment authority and force Shell to decarbonize, and that this was going to happen in like the near future, or at least the future that they were concerned with. And that's why they wanted me, a left-wing historian of this generation or whatever, to come out there and tell them about it. And the deals that they make for these consulting deals, they're way better than writing, right? You get paid like way more money, and you don't have to do like any work. You can just like bullshit. You don't have to do citations. They're just like, what do you think about la la la? And they or whatever in this situation is like the CFO of Shell, and you can just bullshit to them. And they pay you, thousands of dollars and fly you business class, which is overrated, by the way. And so they think that like no one's going to screw up this situation because it's a really good deal. And so they don't make you sign non-disclosure agreements. And so I said, totally, Shell, I would love to come plan the future with you. And then I emailed an editor I knew at New York Magazine, who is himself a climate change reporter, and said, like, I've got a great story, which is that I'm going to go and find out how Shell is thinking about climate change. And so I did this. I went and reported on what they were doing, and I got to interview, C-level Shell executives who knew I was a journalist, who knew I was a left-wing writer and were saying stuff to me anyway, because that's the sort of impunity they think they can buy for a couple grand. They regretted that, which we found out later because a Senate subpoena on Shell emails actually led to an email thread about this article coming out, where they're like, oh no. Like, oh, nothing we could have done. Like, he was committed to this, throwing up their hands. And it's actually really funny because one of the Shell executives is responding on this thread and says, what's New York Magazine? And the like communications expert is like, don't even worry about it. No one reads that rag. Like, it's a local thing. People confuse it with the New Yorker sometimes, but it's not the same. I thought that was pretty funny. All of which is to say, I hope, I have good reason to believe I got more out of them than they got out of me during the scenario planning exercise. And one of the things I got was this interview with this economic analyst who was working for Shell. I think actually the company that he was working for got bought by Shell, which is sort of how Shell was handling part of its recruitment problem with young workers, is they just like buy the company you work at and then you work for Shell, even if you were working at like a green battery charging startup or whatever. It's like now you're Shell's green battery startup. And I was talking to him about what decarbonization for Shell means in practice. If Shell says we're going to decarbonize, we're going to get rid of all these wells, what happens to a well, an oil well, when Shell decides to decarbonize it? And he told me, oh, well, we sell it. And I was like, okay, well who are you selling this to? If all these oil companies are decarbonizing, like who's going to buy the oil well? And he says, well, someone who can operate it at a lower cost. And that means evading labor standards, and it means invading environmental standards, in particular by what's called flaring oil, which is burning off excess gas rather than trying to capture it, which is producing more fossil fuel emissions, obviously, in the practice, and is very harmful to the local environment as well as the climate as a whole. And that's what decarbonization means for Shell, is that they sell the oil well to someone else who's still going to operate it, and is going to operate it actually worse for all of us. And so decarbonization for Shell has little to nothing to do with decarbonization for the planet or for society. And in fact, he was telling me, these operators are going to be much harder to regulate. They're going to be hiding behind different corporate shells. You won't even be able to find who they are, never mind exercise the kind of control you exercise over a big publicly traded company like Shell, where you can do pressure campaigns and shareholder campaigns and stuff like that. These will be more like transnational criminal organizations, like the war on drugs kind of situation, except they're selling fossil fuels. And this would be the case even if we banned fossil fuels tomorrow. And I was sort of like, well, okay, like that sounds pretty bad, right? Like that's not really planning decarbonization. And what he told me is, well, we don't plan to lose money. And even after I published the article, that was the sentence that really stuck with me because it was very dramatic. We don't plan to lose money. And you can put the emphasis in different places, and they're all very important, right? Like, we don't plan to lose money, or like, we don't plan to lose money. Uh, and it emphasizes that this is who's doing the planning for society, for the planet itself, are these shell functionaries who have an injunction not to lose money. And if this guy decides tomorrow he has a crisis of conscience and he needs to quit his job, which he could have after my article, who knows? Someone else is going to take that job, and they're going to do the exact same thing. And if his boss decides, actually, this is really good advice, we need to do things a different way, he'll get fired. And if he's in charge, then the shareholders will sue them and make sure someone else is in charge. And those shareholders aren't just like a big room of like big stomached monopoly guys or whatever. They're like teachers' pension funds that need to pay out benefits to retired workers who are relying on these companies to plan not to lose money. And that's a different problem than we think of it, right? When we think about the climate crisis, we don't think about it in terms of a impersonal, vast, distributed social metabolism that we can't control. We think of it as like a problem of greed and short-term priorities. We think of it as a problem of like bad policy or collective action problems or denial or other like psychological things. But this is a deep structural problem that goes all the way to how we make a living for ourselves, everyone in the world, how we make a living for ourselves. Because it's not just Shell that's going to feel compelled to operate these oil wells, and it's not just the people that Shell is selling them to that feel compelled to operate them. It's workers who are going to feel compelled to go operate these same oil wells. And you're going to find workers everywhere in the world where you've got these oil wells who feel compelled to go to these oil wells and sell their labor, even in very dangerous, situations, even in situations where they're helping their employer evade labor laws, evade environmental laws for which they're paying the cost. They're going to be able to find workers to do that. And it's not because those workers have a gun to their head and someone's going to say, like, we're going to kill you and kill your family if you don't go over to the oil well. That does happen, but that's not the dominant form, right? And it's not that those people think, oh, I'm going to go get rich if I work at this oil well. Some people might, but again, it's not the dominant form. It's that everyone knows that on some level, if you can't find a way to make yourself valuable within this system, the things that you need in order to live will be taken from you. You'll be kicked out of your home. You won't be able to provide shelter for yourself and your immediate family. You won't be able to feed yourself. You won't be able to provide medical care for yourself and your loved ones. And if the way people have to make a living for themselves and the people that they take care of, is to go work at an oil well where they are destroying the habitability of the earth for themselves and their families, they will do it. And we know, water is life, right? That water is required to live. Clean water is required to live. We know that clean air is required to live. We know that a temperate enough climate is required to live. And yet we act like, everywhere in the world we act like, from here to China to Venezuela to anywhere in the world, we act like oil is more important. We act like fossil fuels are more important to our lives than the habitability of our environment. And with this book, I wanted to take that idea seriously, because I don't think that that's because people are like stupid or greedy or short-sighted. I believe that's real, that they really are stuck in a place where, and we are all stuck in a place where we can be compelled to destroy the habitability of our own planet, where we will fight for the opportunity to destroy the habitability of our own planet if that's how we can make a living. and that we're all required to make a living in this competitive way, and that is a fundamentally different problem than an environmental problem, right? That isn't a problem where we need a new piece of environmental regulation. Like I said, we could ban internal combustion engine cars in the United States tomorrow. Snap our fingers. Maybe that's the first thing I would do if I was dictator of the United States, right? Ban internal combustion engine cars tomorrow. What would happen to those cars? They wouldn't disappear. They wouldn't vanish. We wouldn't tear them up for scrap mostly. They'd be sold to other places. People would put them on boats and sell them to other places where people would put gasoline in them and drive them, because then they could get to their job easier, or then they could run the food that they produce into a cooling system faster if they use a gas-powered vehicle. And that can be the difference between making a living for themselves and the people around them and not. And that is a system of like social metabolic control. That is a question of how can we decide what happens on our planet. And that the way I describe this problem is through a syllogism of oil value life. If fossil fuels are valuable in this world, and they are, and value is the system by which we organize our access to life, which it is, then any viable strategy, even like analytically viable strategy, even possibly viable strategy, has to address that chain. If it doesn't, it's not a climate change policy. It might be some economic policy, it might be a trade policy or something. So like $7,500 to buy a US-made electric vehicle instead of a Chinese-made electric vehicle, right? That's a signature American climate policy, so we're told. That has nothing to do with the actual problem. And that actual problem is operating, like I said, not just in places where people are greedy, and not just in places where you have bad leadership or like capricious leaders, because leaders of countries face the same conditions that individuals do about having to provide for the people they care for. I mean, you can think about them as corporate heads, right, who will be voted out or replaced in the same way that corporate leaders will if they can't provide the most for their people. But you can also think about them as like family leaders, right, who care about the people who live in their country and know that in this world system, access to goods, access to the things people want and the things people need in much of the world is controlled through fossil fuels. And that if you refuse on the behalf of the future not to exploit those fossil fuels, people will find a way to remove you. Not because you're wrong, but because they need to find ways to live. And so the book, as I construct it, is a look at 3 different paths that I think are the even just analytically viable ways to address this situation. The first one I call market craft, which is the idea that societies use markets as tools to produce the outcomes that we want. And if one of the outcomes that we want right now is decarbonization, that's how we need to construct our markets, both by repressing fossil fuel emissions and by supporting the construction of the materials that we need in order to decarbonize our economy, which is a pretty simple, like sort of like liberal idea on its face. But the line for me for viable strategies is we have to acknowledge that it's the society's prerogative to decide what happens, that it's society's prerogative to plan the use of our resources and the distribution thereof, and our priorities, that it's not up to a small capitalist class. And so ultimately this first strategy really unfolds to the socialization of the investment function, which is that, yeah, there's going to be a market, there'll be jobs, but it's going to be up to society itself to decide how we're allocating these things, how we're arranging these things. And we're going to use the market as a tool to get there. It's not some like ancient god we have to appease. It's not the truth of human nature. It's one of many tools that human societies use. The second strategy is called public power, which says if there's something that we decide as a society that we need to do, let's say plan a new electrical transmission grid with micro backup grids, that we don't have to rely on private actors to decide it's worthwhile for them to do. That at the end of the day, we have to have the ability to step in as a society and say, we're going to build the things we need, and we're going to maintain them, and we're going to operate them in the interest of society as a whole, not in the partial interest of people who might profit from these institutions. And so the title of the strategy is a little punny because you've got public power, as in the power of the public and the working class, which is operating the planning function on behalf of society as a whole, which is crucial as the political basis for this strategy. But you also have public power as in like public utilities, public power generation, like literally planning the decarbonized grid that we need and operating and maintaining it as well, not just relying on private contractors who might decide that they want to build this, but might not. And the best example in the United States context is probably the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was under the auspices of the New Deal and FDR, who looked at the South in the United States, where capital had decided it wasn't worth it to electrify, that it just wasn't in their interest to build the electrical generation and transmission capacity in order to have a electrical grid, and said, it's in our collective interest to do so. And so we'll create an agency, we'll create this government company that's going to be backed by the federal government that can raise the money and hire the people and employ the people necessary to build the things we need in order to accomplish this task of really like developing the South, which was a really undeveloped area, not just of the country, but of the world at this point. And they were able to accomplish this amazingly fast, shockingly so, and to great effect. And capital very quickly discovered that it was in their interest for there to be like cheap and reliable electricity flowing in the region, and took advantage of it at that point. But it took public power, both politically and logistically, infrastructurally, in order to build that foundation. And then the third strategy, I tried to, like with these strategies and the naming, to work in the strategies themselves and not try to do like political identities. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is to try and avoid people getting like reactive to the strategies. I wanted people to hear them out on their own terms. Because even if they might not be my strategy, I'm trying to I try to give the strongest version of each of the strategies that I can. I try to develop it as best I could psychologically. But in the third strategy, I gave up on my strategy, and I called the third strategy communism. But yeah, not a very triggering term, right? Like, it doesn't make people reactive at all. And I decided to do that. I played around with other like constructions I could have used, like commonizing or whatever, community, things that people might like be able to step back and listen to me a little bit more. But I decided that was a like violation of my implicit promise to write the best I could for the reader at all times. Whenever I tried it on the page, it felt wrong. It felt like I was like cheating or selling or not being honest. And I think readers can pick up on that. And so the communist strategy, what I call the communist strategy and what I believe is the communist strategy, says any social metabolic order that's based upon this value question, that says every person in the world has to make themselves valuable to the system, regardless of who they are and their situation and their needs, is not going to work. Because then we can't even consider our collective needs in a real sense, because we're always pitting them against each other competitively. How many shoes do we need for the people in this room is not a question about how many feet we have, right? It's a question about how many shoes different people in the room can afford based on how valuable they can make themselves in this competitive system. And that becomes a real, maybe not be a big deal with shoes per se, if everyone in the room has shoes, but it becomes a real problem when you talk about a need like decarbonization, which is an absolute collective need that we can't buy individually. No person can purchase decarbonization. And so we need a system that can evaluate, a social metabolic order, as it's called, that can evaluate our needs on something other than a value-based basis. We can think about our needs as like animals as members of a human species that has particular biological requirements in order to live well. And that requires a different framework of understanding. That's a different arrangement of society than this question of value. And the communist answer says we arrange our society according to the algorithm of from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, with the acknowledgement that in this moment, our one need that is absolutely shared by every person in the entire world, even equally to a certain degree, is decarbonization and is the victory over the climate crisis. And my conclusion is that there's not one answer, that all of these strategies have things that they're best at and flaws. And I try to think about that less as like, oh, we need the right shaped key for the particular lock, and more like these are all puzzle pieces that have to fit together. And they have to fit together in a way that we'll be able to look back and call that solved puzzle, the solution to the climate crisis. And the thing about puzzle pieces is if they were perfectly round, if they had everything, all tight, you wouldn't be able to lock them together. It wouldn't work. You wouldn't have a puzzle. And so puzzle pieces need these like protrusions and these inlets. And so all of these strategies have these protrusions and inlets. And I try to be really even-handed in the way that I describe them. And the conclusion is really about how we can bring them together in a kind of coherence that doesn't require a false unity. Because the partisans of each of these strategies are not going to be able to convince everyone else in the world that they're right in the relevant time period, right? We're talking about years, not decades for some things, and decades and definitely not centuries for other things, right? We're in a really limited time scale. And in that time scale, we need to find ways, progressives, people who are dedicated to the three strategies, across the three strategies that I describe, need to find ways to find coherence among ourselves across those lines, need to understand what each other is up to, even if it's not all the same thing, such that we will be able to look back from the other side of this. And once again, I really do believe we will be on the other side of this. And say all of those people didn't necessarily believe in the same things. Sometimes we fought. Sometimes we said and did unforgivable things. But we were all part of this same climate movement that was victorious over what is truly a planetary emergency that is elapsing all around us right now. And on this Earth Day, it's incumbent on us to think in those planetary terms and think from the planet we want back to where we are and how we can get there together. Thank you all so much. I'll take questions.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I haven't read the book yet, so I'm excited to. Thanks for
What?
the primer.
Oh
I am curious if you thought about sort of the premise of climate change being that humans want to persist in the comfort that we persist in today, and whether there's sort of a, not necessary, but possible reality where the climate changes and we don't persist the way that we have, and how that would shape capitalism or communism or whatever sort of path we go down to try to steer things back the other way.
No, I think the premise for the crisis is that we will not live the same way. And in fact, we are not living the same way already. That the climate crisis is a planet-scale disaster that is going to destroy people's way of living around this planet, completely. And an analogy I draw is to proletarianization in the 19th century, where people got thrown off the land, got thrown into factories in a way that destroyed people's entire social universe, right? That destroyed the way that they imagined their children's lives were going to be, the way that they'd lived in the past, their connection to their past, basic cycles in their life. That's all going to change, and that's already baked in, right? Like this is already happening. So I don't think there's any way that things don't change. The question is how we manage that changing, and whether we are all collectively going to plan for that change, or if it's going to be a question of competition, of nationalism, of racialism, of regionalism. Are they going to start building walls around cities? Right? It feels like we're headed in that way to a certain degree, where you have just the basic criminalization of people sleeping outside, the genocide in Gaza. We've seen every red line of the 20th century crossed already, basically. Things that I grew up at the end of the 20th century assuming were decided historical questions have been reopened in the past years, like just last few years, this year. This will continue happening. Like the world as we came to assume it is over. And the question is, what's the next world going to be?
I know we have something online. Sorry. Let's see. Patrick asks, do you think solar punk as a genre, aesthetic ideology, etc., has the ability to empower communities with hope and agency for inspiring action in response to the current polycrisis, as opposed to despair or worse, fatalistic opportunism?
That's a great question. Thanks, Patrick. I think a lot of art and literature can help us understand our moment and even get hope in this moment. And I'm not a sci-fi guy personally. You can boo if you want to. It's okay. I know a lot of my comrades are strong sci-fi folks. I like realist literature, like Victorian literature sometimes even. I was an English major. I love literature, and I talk about literature a lot in this book, even if I'm not using the sci-fi, solar punk, or Ministry for the Future stuff that people would assume are the references. One book I talk about is a New Deal era American novel called The Storm by, I believe it's George Stewart. And it's this really cool book about climate crisis, but the climate crisis is a giant storm in California in the 1930s. And the main character of this book is society itself, with this very New Deal era society as itself, where it's about how the state and social bureaucratic organs are responding to this storm. And it's awesome, and it's extremely dramatic, and you follow out the junior meteorologist as he's making the calculations, and the load distributor guy is this main character at the power company who has to reroute the electricity around the storm. And then you go to the woman who's operating the telephone system, who has to figure out where the break is and manage people's calls based on when they come in and people's emergencies and stuff. And it makes you realize that people have dealt with questions like this before. They've dealt with emergencies before, and they've thought about how society should be arranged to deal with. They've dealt with climate emergencies before. That many societies have dealt with climate emergencies before. And so I think literature is an incredibly valuable place for looking for inspiration and answers. The one place I use I guess probably solar punk aesthetic stuff is in the beginning of the Marketcraft chapter, where I talk about this short video that maybe some of you have seen, and it's called Alice's Farm. And it shows this near future green farm where you've got it's a cartoon. It's Studio Ghibli style before the AI stuff though, so they really paid for it. And there's a cow lounging under a solar panel, and they're using cloud seeding machines to water the crops, and everyone's really happy and chill and not working that hard, and they're blimps and stuff. And this is maybe one of the most famous and prevalent views of a positive ecological future in the United States, and it's a yogurt commercial. It's a commercial for Chobani yogurt, and someone actually the version that became so popular is someone went in and removed all the labels. They just erased all the ad parts, And they said, like, isn't it nice now? And it is. And that's, for me, it gives some insight to the market craft strategy, which involves sort of scraping that part off capitalism as we go. Whereas once we have the things that we need in order to live like good, chill lives, we won't have to like compete in that same way, both as individuals and then as companies within it. We won't need the like Chobani logos on everything in order to pay for the stuff that gives us a good life. So that's one of the places in the book, at least, where I drew cyberpunk inspiration, or solar punk inspiration, rather.
Hello. In Palo Alto, near the end of the book, you talk about how you foresee basically the destruction of the world before the end of Palo Alto. And then after that, like land back attempts could happen in like the Bay. Do you see like land back or like different land management techniques that could be done to support decarbonization attempts as like a possible way to achieve decarbonization?
Absolutely. It's in fact, that's a large part of the third strategy, where I'm talking about indigenous social metabolic orders all around the world, not just in the United States, because like some people think like indigeneity is a problem in the settler colonies of like Canada, Australia, and the United States, and that's it, or whatever. And like everyone else has their own country. You often hear this from Zionists, like everyone gets their own country. How come we don't get a country? There are many, 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 many peoples all around the world in every country that do not have their own country, and that are trying to maintain. There are 500 million indigenous people around the world who are fighting for different social metabolic orders. And that isn't to say like, and so they're all good because they're all different than capital. You have to really do some analysis. And one of the pieces of analysis that I cite in the book is this UN study about biodiversity management in indigenous communities all around the world. And they're just better at it. And it's because they rely more directly on the biodiversity around them in their own social metabolic order, which leads to these like incredible ironies where you have charitable Americans and Europeans paying into charitable foundations that in order to like save land, go in and force indigenous people off land that they are the best possible managers of in the world, at gunpoint forcing them out, saying, "Look, well, this has to be a eco reserve. Get out of here." Even if you are the ones who, even if the humans are the keystone species who are maintaining the biodiversity of many, many dozens of different species of plants and animals, we have this sort of SimCity Western idea that you just sort of control the variables, that you need this much energy and this many trees. And like if all the bees die, you just replace them with robot bees or whatever. And that doesn't work. And it doesn't work politically because that's 500 million people who will fight you, who will fight to protect, and who are right to fight you, who are right to protect their land, and who are fighting on all of our behalf. But it also doesn't work ecologically because the world is not actually a SimCity game where you like play with a few different variables where it's just like energy and carbon absorption or whatever. The world is many, 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 uncountably many individual ecological systems that overlap and interlace in ways that no individual could possibly understand as a whole. But many people have devoted many like whole histories of their society to understanding over time particular parts of it. And we absolutely cannot forsake that understanding of particular places in a world. One way I put it in the book is that you can't destroy the world in its to save the world in its generality, you can't destroy the world in its particularity, right? It doesn't make sense. It's not logical. And so that's one of the real arguments I want to get across in the book, which doesn't mean that we don't need enough energy, right? And it doesn't mean that there aren't people attached to dialysis machines. And it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be more people attached to dialysis machines. There are lots of people who deserve more access to energy than they have right now. But we can't pretend that means that we don't have to think about the world and its particularities, or rely on the people who know more about the world and its particularities.
It's kind of scary and tinny, but I work for the Park Service, and I am like actively a biodiversity manager. And it's funny because the land I take care of is Tennessee Valley in Marin, which it's just funny that it came up with Tennessee Valley Authority. But I often think about this, how I'm like perversely, like my body is in the place where like indigenous peoples have managed forever. And so anyway, I guess my question is about, you are obviously practiced at talking about the climate crisis, and in the Park Service, we talk a lot about how difficult it is to just introduce the conversation, and it's a big focus. Like, how do we talk to people about it, and how do you bring it up in conversation? It's sort of like the elephant in the room. So I wonder if you have any, like, from your experience of making this book, practice for us, and how to bring it up.
How to talk to the people about the climate crisis. So I think people have a problem understanding things that they can't solve. And I don't think that's wrong, right? I think that's like correct, that you can't really process something that you don't have an approach to solve. And so if you say like, oh yeah, there's a problem where like the world's ending, and people are like, okay, it's hard to integrate that information. And I feel like climate denial has taken this kind of different shape, where it's not like people say like, oh, that's made up, or that's a like conspiracy or whatever. It's sort of like, yeah, and so what we're doing is reacting to it every day in the ways that we can, which is not much, because we can't actually control what happens in our society. And so I think people can understand better when they feel like they can make a difference, like they feel like they're organizing in order to change stuff. Because you never feel more helpless than when you're not doing anything. Right, and so we'll never feel more at victims of the climate crisis, at the mercy of a warming climate, than when we're not involved in collective projects in order to confront the social forces that are causing this warming. So like, getting mad at our enemies is one way that I find that you can change people's emotional register from despair and depression to something that I think is more useful, which is anger and determination, because we are in a struggle. This is a conflict, and we have to be determined to fight and win. And I think it becomes a more approachable problem when we think about it as that kind of struggle, rather than as something that, like, for some reason I keep kicking myself in the face and I can't stop myself, and people keep telling me that like that's going to really lead to some like problems with my brain if I keep kicking myself in the face. But every day I get up and kick myself in the face. So like, yeah, it's really a shame about this like kicking myself in the face thing. But what's she gonna do? It's the climate, And once it becomes a social question of social struggle, I think it becomes less a question of like, what am I doing and what can I do, and what are we doing and what can we do.
Sorry, a bit of a European economist question.
Oh God, I've had enough of them now.
I'm doing climate change, sustainable finance also for years, and I think it's very much that it has to do with hyperbolic discounting, that we would like to postpone everything that we would have to suffer right now. And maybe in the end it's really, and it's funny to say this in the US, but that we need some regulation. And I think maybe us in Europe, especially us in Luxembourg, we were not so bad. So we required, for instance, pension funds to only invest in stamped ESG investments, or we made public transport, for instance, for free, so you can commute. I mean, Luxembourg is a small place, but maybe for a city like San Francisco that could work as well. Because the other idea, if you only rely on the market, we tried this already 30 years ago with Kyoto, trading carbon, didn't work. If we try to rely on the individual, it seems also not to work. I mean, as we see right now, the world is changing to the worse, I would say, especially over here. So maybe the third thing is really the solution, say this communism, which I still have to read, but maybe you mean also regulation a bit with it. So maybe we really have to accept that we need some regulation, whether it's from a government or maybe even from a world institution that tells us, please do it like this, otherwise we will still sit here in 10 years and maybe nothing will change.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the core of the market craft strategy, is that we need to use whatever tools we have to create the market, not just to respond to the market as if it's a separate entity, but to create the conditions for the market actors to perform what we want them to perform to. I say that from a market craft perspective, complaining about the outcomes of the market is like going to the imaginary tea party with your stuffed animals and blaming them for the quality of the cucumber sandwiches. Right? It's like, this is your tea party, right? We are a society. We should be setting up the conditions for market actors to act in the first place. And I think, apologies to the continent of Europe, China is far ahead in these questions, just in terms of every level, in terms of the market. And this is a capitalist strategy, right? Far, far ahead. And not just in industrial production or what we think of industrial production, but things like trees. Far, far leagues ahead of the rest of the world in terms of planting trees. And that shows that there's something to these strategies, that there is something functional there, but that it requires a government that's really determined to do so. So you think about something like Bitcoin mining is banned in China. You can't use Chinese energy resources to mine Bitcoin, which serves no social purpose except to create capitalist class domination, right? And you have a society that says, like, that's bad. We are not going to use our energy that way. Seems pretty reasonable to me. But one of the examples I use in the book is there's a New York State bill to ban not Bitcoin mining in general, but the construction of fossil fuel-based Bitcoin mines, which is like the worst thing you could possibly do in the world, right? Like a totally useless use of both our carbon budget and energy itself, both of which are extremely precious. And the building trades, organized labor that's supposed to be acting in the collective interest, came out and said, no, we don't want the governor to sign this bill because it's in our interest to build those facilities. And we can shake our heads at that, but they're not wrong. And those are jobs that are going to specific people who have specific needs and specific families to take care of. And they might not be able to get other specific jobs in that specific place in their world that are going to provide in the same way that these jobs will, even if those jobs themselves are undermining that world in which they live, right? And so it's not just about being like sympathetic to that, but to understand that that's a major barrier for accomplishing what we need to, that we're, once again, kicking ourselves in the face. And knowing it and explaining it and say like, well, I got to kick myself in the face every day from 9 to 5. That's how I afford this apartment. It's really expensive. My rent has gone up 15%. In fact, I got to kick myself in the face harder every day if I'm going to afford the rent in this city, And so we militate against our own solutions in a way.
I think we have time for one more question. Any takers? Yeah.
How do you think abundance is compatible with your three-pronged strategy? And I guess my other question is, do you think this is a winning strategy for Democrats if they adopt it as a blueprint? I mean, it seems to fall under kind of the market craft section.
All right, I'll read the paragraph that I think is. This is in the section where I'm talking about the points of coherence. I don't do readings usually at this thing. I'm sorry to this customer whose book I'm flipping my way through. This question of should we just say like yes and build stuff is not quite the right way to think about it. And I want you to keep in mind that I wrote this, paragraph before anyone published any abundance book or whatever. I'm not doing this in response to anything. This is a conclusion of this book. And so one of the points of coherence that I list is building power. And I say, building power is not just about kilowatt hours. Though a lot of the strategic focus is on decarbonizing this or abolishing that, everyone agrees there's going to be a lot of building going on. From food forests, to solar panels, to dense housing, to bicycles, to electricity cables, to microorganisms, to all sorts of stuff we don't even know about yet, we will have to build the plane as we struggle for control of the cockpit. As we look to influence production plans, we should keep the political struggle in mind, principally the balance of class power at all levels. A deal to subsidize solar panels or electric cars could backfire if it isn't structured to protect labor's bargaining power in that sector. And producing tons of electric cars is probably not all that strategic if it further delays an inevitable social reckoning with a wasteful car-centered life that alienates working people from one another. Building power means being politically attentive as we pursue the constructive parts of our partisan strategies, thinking through the implications for the whole left field into the future. So that's my line on like, should we build? Is like, build yes, think less no.
And on that note, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thanks to all of you in the audience and to those of you online. And we will have a signing now. And thank you again.
Thank you.